Often hailed to be the best era of Godzilla, the Heisei was both the start and the end for a great number of things about Godzilla, making it hard to disagree with that statement. It was the last to truly have a cohesive narrative that primarily did follow Godzilla's evolution as a character. It also was the first to truly evolve Godzilla as a character beyond his anti-nuclear and anti-superweapon allegory he started as threads of that were still woven throughout even the late Showa era. As for his evolution as a character, it maintained very strong internal consistency, something that I actually hope to explain in a future video focusing more specifically on him. As a journey from outright antagonist to hero is not something that is told as well as Heisei Godzilla's was. While it did focus on Godzilla's character, the era also pioneered many aspects of kaiju battling, keeping them very dynamic as well as unique. Nothing since then has really felt the same way, while also featuring some of the most bombastic stories that the series has ever had. And in conjunction with the more refined suit construction and special effects, superior dubbing quality, it lacks many of the unfair criticisms that plague the Showa era. As great as the Millennium era is, its much more decentralized narrative following an anthology series, and the monster vs. recent turmoil both do not lend themselves to as central of a narrative. Many of these fantastical stories that the Heisei era has are far more absurd than those that preceded it with the Showa era and succeeded it in the Millennium and Monsterverse era, and I mean this in the best possible way. But above all else, what made it was Godzilla's foes. And because all of them, barring Mothra, were villains, if I slip up and say villains, I'm not saying Mothra is a villain. She just simply isn't. In fact, she is the only unambiguously good kaiju pretty much in all of kaiju history. Just know that I forgot to say Mothra and the villains, or I say villains as opposed to foes. It's not something I am doing intentionally, it's just because I'm a bit of an idiot. As for beyond that, who I am your dummy dinosaur, your favorite American Allosaurus, Max Allo. And if you guys haven't done so already, please don't forget to subscribe for more. Comment your thoughts below on Heisei Era Godzilla. Who is your favorite of his enemies? What is your favorite movie? What was the first one that you saw? And don't forget to also leave a like on the video as well. With the recent change that YouTube has made to the algorithm, all three of those things are very important to help this video get pushed out more into the algorithm. Without one of those, the video kind of stagnates until YouTube fixes its algorithm, which is probably never going to happen. The most impressive part of the Heisei era is actually that it was never planned. Every movie was more or less made as they went. They never really did anything like what Marvel did, where there's a whole long-form plan going up all the way to the end. They would make these movies and play it by ear. And yet, they would go on to create some of Godzilla's most iconic foes. Not even just for their designs, because, in truth, an iconic character is not just an impressive design. It is every component, every facet of the character, from the design to their personality, to their mannerisms, to the nature of their conflict with the hero or antagonist they go against. Destroya as a monster is one of the most unique kaiju, with all of his different forms, just how drastic they are, and his very striking demonic design. The simply grotesque body horror nature of Destroya, Biollante, and Space Godzilla themselves, just as deformed as they are, as monstrous and mutant as they just present. These unholy, unnatural abominations of science, appearing far more as eldritch horrors than kaiju. Even Batra, despite being patterned on Mothra, departs heavily enough from his base to be his own distinct design and character. However, as said before, design isn't everything. It can help get a foot in the door to get people to be receptive to these characters, but what truly cements them is, as particular with the Heisei era, is that each of these are actually a reflection of an aspect of Godzilla. Either his personality, his history, the fundamental nature of him, a shadow that his destruction has cast upon the world, and even the good within him. They're more than just foes to the King of the Monsters. They're a piece of himself, as twisted as they are. The first of these was Biollante, this horrific mass of vines, tentacles, Venus flytraps, teeth, is a horrific combination, a chimeric horror of Godzilla's DNA, a rose bush's DNA, and human DNA all blended together. This creature is actually the same concept as what Godzilla came to embody and was continued to be for a majority of the Heisei era. That of the dangers of genetic manipulation, genetic engineering, and the potential dangers this could bring. This being a fundamental aspect of Godzilla vs. Biollante in the rush to create the anti-nuclear energy bacteria, which is derived from Godzilla's own DNA, to create something which can feed upon nuclear energy in the same way Godzilla does, to cripple and kill him. Now, Biollante's origin is not as a weapon specifically to counter Godzilla, but rather as a scientist after the loss of his daughter many years earlier, spliced her DNA into a rosebush. This is because in this era, Godzilla and psychics are, well, psychic. By preserving a fragment of her consciousness, he was in a way able to keep her alive as a sort of twisted comfort. And after his research on the Godzilla cells incurred some rather nefarious actors to attempt to steal the Godzilla cells he was working on, the rosebush was damaged and began dying. In hopes of preserving his daughter that much longer, he played God in the most twisted way imaginable, splicing in the Godzilla cells with the rosebush cells, melding these three genomes into what was at first a more humanoid plant-like structure, a giant rose. But this twisted form would not last. After encountering and even calling to Godzilla, as the two were seemingly one and the same, derived from the same cells, Biollante's later plant-beast form shows the sheer dominating effect Godzilla's DNA has, that it is uncontrollable, growing far larger than even Godzilla himself, becoming the first of several enemies in the Heisei era to actually manage to defeat Godzilla, though this is in part to the anti-nuclear energy bacteria that was administered to Godzilla far earlier in the film, heavily weakening his ability to damage her, though she does put up an impressive fight, her acid melting through and even piercing Godzilla's hands. It does call back to the original nature of Godzilla, being the only way to destroy a super weapon is with a super weapon of one's own, only in this case it is genetic abomination versus another genetic abomination. Though that still human fragment within Biollante eventually has her disperse and leave, choosing instead to no longer be a destroyer and vanish on the wind, journeying to outer space where she can no longer cause harm, as Godzilla, weakened and, well, being eaten away at the inside by humanity's one countermeasure, slowly crawled back to the ocean and was only saved from death by the cold waves, which allowed him to return to the depths of the ocean and suffer in cold silence. Unable to die, but unable to truly live. With Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, they reinvented Godzilla's arch-nemesis. While in this version he is still potentially an alien, given that the three Dorats which eventually spawned King Ghidorah are in the novel and original draft for the movie, having been created from DNA collected from the super space monster King Ghidorah on the planet Venus. This is absent from the film, but it's just something nice to think about. Turns King Ghidorah into another counterpart of Godzilla, in this case being a historical counterpart, by having the three Dorats and the later King Ghidorah they merge into swapping places with Godzilla in the historical version of events that happen in the Godzilla Heisei continuity. It also explores what Godzilla's backstory and history was before his mutation. As in this timeline, he was simply a dinosaur known as the Godzillasaurus living on Lagos Island, unintentionally saving a detachment of Japanese soldiers during the Second World War and being grievously injured by American shore bombardments in return. After this is when the timelines change. To prevent Godzilla from being formed, the Futurians, recognizing he is the greatest enemy in their attempt to destroy Japan in the future by traveling back to the past, is to transport him to the Bering Sea, where he will simply expire and be absent from history. And in their place, they leave behind the three Dorats. As Godzilla was mutated from the Godzillasaurus into Godzilla by the atomic testing on the island, these three Dorats fused into King Ghidorah, a monster which is under their complete control. This also best reflects the opposition between both Godzilla and King Ghidorah here. Godzilla is a creature of the past, a dinosaur that survived all the way into the present. And King Ghidorah was a creature from the future that traveled back to the past to be created. One came the long way. The other had to unnaturally travel there. One is a creature under their own control, whereas the other is simply a puppet of humanity's future. Again, furthering the genetic engineering and modification thread throughout these movies. Godzilla was actually an inevitability in the timeline, as in the Bering Sea, a Soviet nuclear submarine crashed near where the Godzillasaurus was placed, mutating the Godzillasaurus anyways into Godzilla. In an attempt to power up Godzilla to face the new menace of King Ghidorah, the Japanese send a nuclear submarine, which Godzilla quickly destroys and absorbs the nuclear energy from, creating a more powerful form of himself capable of defeating the three-headed future dragon. And with King Ghidorah being vanquished and later reformed into Mecha King Ghidorah, once again another thing from the future traveling back to face and stop Godzilla, his inevitability reasserts itself. At best, his fight with Mecha King Ghidorah ends in a tie, with Mecha King Ghidorah left in a broken wreck at the bottom of the ocean, and Godzilla, though deposited there, still alive. And now cured of his anti-nuclear energy bacteria infection. Returned to full power, and then some. Mothra is actually a bit of an oddity, as she doesn't really reflect anything about Godzilla. In fact, she reflects nothing about Godzilla at all. This is because, historically, she was created as an independent character, who was eventually subsumed into the greater Godzilla series. She is the only unambiguously good and heroic kaiju, where everyone else is somewhere in the morally gray ether, shifting either between good or evil to simply indifference. This is why this section is actually far more about Batra, and what makes him a much more interesting figure in the Heisei era is that while he is derived from Mothra, he ultimately shares a lot of qualities with both Showa Godzilla and Heisei Godzilla, as both would turn from a traditionally more antagonistic role into a much more heroic role. Though it is worth noting, Batra is still outright a villain at the start. He does go through a bit of a redemption arc throughout the film. This arc actually being a foreshadowing in a way of what Heisei Godzilla's own character arc would be, and actually was starting to be, as the prior Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah had established this far more sympathetic side to Godzilla. We see that he does not want to be a destroyer, but in this twisted, more mutated form, he sees destruction as really the only thing he can do, as he is himself a monster. Batra, on the other hand, carries the trailing end of what Godzilla's story would eventually become, even though, again, that part of the story was never written yet. Batra died in battle against Godzilla, helping Mothra, the hero, to stop the antagonistic and aggressive Godzilla, though at the cost of his own life. Something which would happen to Heisei Godzilla himself, falling in battle after defeating Destroya. Mechagodzilla 2 is this on two separate levels. First of them being, yes, he is a chromed out version of Godzilla. His physical form is quite literally a reflection and imitation of Godzilla. But on a level deeper than that, the intention behind his creation, many of his weapon systems and even actually his defensive systems, are designed to invert the relationship between humanity and Godzilla, to create a Godzilla for Godzilla. Whereas Godzilla is impervious, invincible to all forms of human weaponry, Mechagodzilla is himself largely impervious to most, if not all, of Godzilla's attacks. The only reason that Godzilla is able to defeat Mechagodzilla early on is his ability to reverse the electrical flow from the shock anchors. Godzilla's atomic ray, his most mighty weapon, is not only useless against Mechagodzilla 2, it's worse than that. Mechagodzilla 2 is able to harness the power of Godzilla's own greatest sword and return it back to him as the plasma grenade, making him both a shield and a sword for humanity to strike back against the King of the Monsters. And just as humanity is occasionally able to delay Godzilla, Godzilla was only able to occasionally delay Mechagodzilla 2. Upon returning and being modified and upgraded, the shock anchors were turned into the G-Crusher weapon system, and the outfitting of compatibility with Garuda rendered Godzilla completely vulnerable to its weapon systems. In fact, to such a degree that it was able to inflict a fatal wound upon Godzilla, destroying his secondary brain, crippling and paralyzing him, and almost killing him. And the comparisons to this being a Godzilla for Godzilla extend beyond that. This is because humanity are actually kind of the villains of the movie. The morality is inverted for this one. In this movie, Godzilla is simply seeking to protect the infant Godzillasaurus. One that, after humanity finds out about the relationship between it and Godzilla, they seek to weaponize this information, lure Godzilla into a trap, and kill him, which ultimately they 90% of the way succeed on that. This is not portrayed as a good thing. It's portrayed as almost cowardly, as not something you are supposed to agree with, as Godzilla is simply wishing to do that which humanity does, to live in peace. And in fact, Godzilla would have actually fallen in battle here if it weren't for Fire Rodan. Fire Rodan himself is also a very interesting one, as He was originally created all those years ago, back in the 50s, as a direct other side of the coin to Godzilla, whereas the original Godzilla was specifically made to represent the American nuclear threat. Rodan was that same nuclear threat, but from the Soviets. So they truly are two sides of the same coin. Another of the monsters that are explicitly designed in Godzilla's image are Space Godzilla. But this is a much more monstrous, twisted, and evil form of Godzilla, something that more closely resembles the way in which humanity views the original and even the Heisei era version, as something of an invader, a destructive, malevolent force that is beyond their ability to fight back against, despite the fact that Mechagodzilla did prove capable of nearly killing Godzilla. Almost being the logical extreme of where Godzilla would have ended had he not gone through the character development he had gone through over the last several movies. Seeing essentially a confrontation between where the changed Godzilla has ended up versus where the start would have led to. One being the more closely following nuclear core of the character, whereas the other is the much more genetically engineered, genetically modified mutant form. A physical conflict between this duality of Godzilla as a concept. This is made all the more clear as humanity, despite having a shared enemy in Space Godzilla, still sees Godzilla as a much graver threat. But it also shows a growing attempt to wish to understand Godzilla, and potentially live together, not harmonious, but at the very least attempt to live peaceably with him. And last, but certainly not least, we have Destroyer. A villain that I can quite literally spend an entire other video, and somewhat already have actually, going over because he is the perfect antithesis of what Godzilla is. But he's a little bit of a departure in that while he is a clone of Junior, he's not actually a reflection of Heisei Godzilla, but rather, he's a reflection of Shodai Goji, the original Godzilla. And if you guys would like, I probably could make another video going over this in far greater detail, because that does sound like a good time. But he is the greatest dark mirror of Godzilla, since the two of them are the same. They're both monsters born out of superweapons of mankind. While Godzilla tends to be compared to nuclear weapons, as they were our only superweapons at the time, Godzilla was created as both a victim and the physical incarnation of superweapons, the consequences of and the destructive force of them, not specifically just nuclear weapons. This is the reason for the Oxygen Destroyer being used to counter him in the original Godzilla. It was humanity's new superweapon, as the two require another superweapon to counter one another. He's a villain that takes the Godzilla series back to the very origin of the concept of Godzilla. But more than that, more than just returning to square one, it stripped out every single thing that made Godzilla redeemable, everything that made Godzilla sympathetic, and most importantly, everything that made Godzilla tragic. It replaces them with the darkest possible versions of what he could have been, creating a psychopathic, omnicidal demon that wishes only to cause death and destruction, as his name suggests, rather than a confused, pained creature stumbling out of the sea as Godzilla was in 54. We are left with a focused, calculating, sadistic monster. One that kills indiscriminately purely for the thrill. Where burning Godzilla in this form is essentially a distillation of all of the positive aspects of Godzilla, both the ones he has accumulated over his near half a century of experience, both Incarnation, Showa, and Heisei had gained. Destroya is the distillation of the darkest of that original one. This final battle is almost a deconstruction and duel to the death of these two almost contrary aspects of Godzilla, that despite being almost completely at odds with one another, they are fundamentally linked. It's one of the things that makes the final battle of the Heisei era so impactful. It's not only one of the most spectacular battles in the entire Godzilla series, but one that packs the full weight of everything the series has accumulated into every strike. It brings everything full circle, but also laid the groundwork for the evolutions that would come after. Even though at the time, they didn't know if there would be any more. This is why the Heisei era was, and always will be, timeless. Each story is unique. Each monster has become iconic, despite many of them only appearing once. Each movie is mostly self-contained. While there are continuing threads between each film, they are held off well enough that each film can be watched on its own, with possibly the exception of Godzilla vs. Biollante, as it does directly pick up where 84 leaves off. Even Godzilla vs. Destroya, which is heavily based upon past films, gives you more than enough information to understand what is going on. And what brings it all together and gives a far greater emotional punch is when you have seen everything and you've followed Godzilla through this entire journey. It creates a singular, coherent story that remained distinct. It wasn't just a random grab bag of monsters thrown into a blender and made to fight a gauntlet one after the other, but a series of broken reflections of Godzilla facing him down. As overdone as the hero and the villain being the same or having several parallels are, it's not nearly as obvious in the Heisei era, and even when there are very obvious parallels, even ones outright stated in the film, there is always a second, far deeper layer at minimum. It's not, let's just make a white Godzilla who shoots ice and a red Kong and throw them up against each other. It's a lovingly crafted story of different monsters. A sequence of events that, even if it wasn't planned out from the start, I don't believe it could have been planned any more perfectly. The Heisei era was truly something special, and I don't think we will ever get anything like it ever again. Maybe Toho can recreate something like it. I hope they can. But this was lightning in a bottle. This was truly the golden age for Godzilla. But that is all from me. If you guys enjoyed what you saw here, don't forget to comment your thoughts below, leave a like on the video, and subscribe for more. I've been Max Allosaurus, Max Allo. And long live the Kaiju King.